Declassified. April 15, 1944. The salt-crusted fishing village of Etretat on the Norman coast lay shrouded in the pre-dawn mist that rolled in from the English Channel like ghostly fingers reaching across the pebbled beaches. The ancient chalk cliffs, scarred white against the grey sky, had witnessed centuries of storms and invasions, but nothing quite like what was unfolding in the narrow cobblestone streets below. Wehrmacht patrols moved through the village with mechanical precision, their jackboots echoing off the stone walls of centuries-old fishermen's cottages, each footfall a reminder of the iron grip the German forces maintained over this strategic stretch of coastline. In the harbor, where generations of Norman fishermen had launched their boats to chase herring and cod through the treacherous waters, concrete bunkers now sprouted like malignant growths along the seawall. Machine gun nests peered out through narrow slits, their barrels trained on the approaches from both land and sea. The occupying forces had transformed this peaceful fishing port into a fortress, one link in Hitler's Atlantic wall that stretched from Norway to Spain. But on this particular morning, as the fog began to lift and reveal the true scope of the German defenses, one man was about to prove that even the most impregnable fortress could be undone by the simplest of innovations. Pierre Dubois crouched behind a pile of rotting fishing nets in the abandoned boat yard, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting. At 53, he was older than most of the resistance fighters operating along the coast, his face carved by decades of battling North Sea storms, his body bent slightly forward from years of hauling nets heavy with the day's catch. The German occupation had stolen his livelihood, requisitioned his boat, and scattered his crew to the four winds, but it had not broken his spirit. What it had done, perhaps unwittingly, was provide him with the greatest challenge of his life, one that would require every ounce of cunning he had learned in 40 years of outwitting fish, weather, and the treacherous currents that had claimed so many of his fellow fishermen. The situation facing the Allied intelligence network in this sector had grown desperate beyond measure. Over the past month, 32 British and American operatives had been systematically captured by German counterintelligence, their carefully constructed identities unraveled with methodical efficiency. These weren't amateur spies caught making rookie mistakes, but seasoned professionals, men and women who had undergone months of rigorous training in the arts of deception, surveillance, and sabotage. They had memorized cover stories down to the smallest detail, learned to speak French with regional accents, and carried documents so perfectly forged that they had fooled customs officials and police inspectors across occupied Europe. Yet somehow, within hours of their arrival in the Etretat sector, they had found themselves in the basement cells of the local Gestapo headquarters, subjected to interrogations that revealed the full extent of German knowledge about Allied intelligence operations. The enemy seemed to know not just when agents would arrive, but exactly where they would make contact with the local resistance network. Safe houses that had operated without detection for years were suddenly compromised. Dead drops that had functioned flawlessly were being monitored. Radio frequencies that had been considered secure were clearly being intercepted and decoded. The mathematics of the situation painted a grim picture that kept Allied commanders awake at night, staring at maps and casualty reports that told the same story over and over again. In just 4 weeks, the Germans had captured more intelligence operatives than in the previous 6 months combined. The carefully planned network of agents who were supposed to coordinate with the coming invasion had been systematically dismantled. Each arrest led to more arrests, each interrogation revealed new details about Allied plans and capabilities, and each day that passed brought the inevitable invasion closer while the intelligence network that was supposed to support it crumbled like sand through desperate fingers. The local resistance leaders had been equally baffled and increasingly paranoid. Accusations flew in whispered conversations held in wine cellars and abandoned barns, as longtime allies began to suspect each other of collaboration. Trust, the most precious commodity in any underground organization, evaporated like morning dew under the harsh glare of repeated failures. Some blamed German infiltration of the resistance itself, imagining double agents who had spent years building credibility only to spring their trap at the crucial moment. Others pointed to new German detection equipment, rumored advances in radio direction finding or document analysis that could expose even the most carefully crafted deceptions. But Pierre Dubois had spent enough time watching the sea to recognize patterns that escaped others, and what he had observed over the past weeks painted a different picture entirely. The Germans weren't relying on superior technology or sophisticated counterintelligence techniques. They had found something far more effective, something so simple and elegant in its brutality that no one in the Allied command structure had even considered it as a possibility. The enemy had turned the very landscape itself into a trap, using the natural features of the coastline and the predictable behavior of human nature to create a net as inescapable as any that Pierre had ever cast into the waters of the English Channel. As he crouched there in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by the tools of his trade, Pierre could almost see the invisible threads of that net stretching across the countryside, connecting observation posts and patrol routes, safe houses and landing beaches, creating a web of surveillance that no traditional espionage training had prepared the Allied agents to recognize or avoid. The question that had kept him awake for the past 3 nights, staring at the ceiling of his tiny cottage while German sentries paced outside, was whether the same principles that allowed a fisherman to predict where fish would swim and how they would react to different stimuli could be applied to the infinitely more complex problem of outwitting an occupying army. The answer to that question would determine not just the fate of future intelligence operations in the sector, but potentially the success or failure of the entire invasion plan that was taking shape across the Channel. In just 48 hours, Pierre Dubois would either validate a theory so unorthodox that it would revolutionize military thinking about deception and counterintelligence, or he would join the 32 Allied agents already languishing in German prisons, his body added to the growing list of French civilians who had paid the ultimate price for their defiance of the occupation. Pierre-Auguste Dubois had never intended to become a warrior in the greatest conflict in human history. Born in the autumn of 1890 in a 2-room cottage that clung to the cliffs above Etretat like a barnacle on a ship's hull, he was the son of a fisherman who was himself the son of a fisherman, part of an unbroken chain stretching back through centuries of Norman maritime tradition. His earliest memories were of salt spray and seagulls, of nets drying in the Mediterranean sun, of his father's calloused hands showing him how to read the subtle signs that distinguished productive waters from barren ones. By the age of 8, he could predict weather changes by the behavior of clouds and estimate the size of a school of fish by the patterns birds made as they wheeled and dove above the waves. The First War had shaped him in ways both subtle and profound. At 24, he had been drafted into the French Navy, where his intimate knowledge of coastal waters made him invaluable for submarine patrols and mine-sweeping operations. He had spent 3 years threading his way through fields of floating death, learning to spot the telltale signs of German U-boats lurking beneath the surface, developing an almost supernatural ability to sense danger in waters that appeared empty and peaceful. When he returned to civilian life in 1918, he brought with him an understanding of warfare that few fishermen possessed, along with a deep appreciation for the strategic importance of seemingly mundane activities like watching shipping lanes and monitoring radio frequencies. The decades between the wars had been good to Pierre. He had married Marie Leclerc, daughter of the village baker, in 1920, and together they had built a modest but comfortable life around the rhythms of the fishing industry. Their boat, the Marie Claire, named for both his wife and the daughter they had lost to influenza in 1925, became one of the most successful vessels in the Etretat fleet. Pierre's reputation for finding fish when others returned empty-handed earned him grudging respect from competitors and steady income from buyers who knew that nets bearing his mark contained the finest catch on the Norman coast. But success in fishing, Pierre had learned, required more than just luck or even skill with nets and navigation. It demanded an almost scientific approach to observation and analysis, the ability to synthesize dozens of variables into accurate predictions about the behavior of creatures that lived in an environment completely alien to human experience. Water temperature, tidal patterns, wind direction, seasonal migration routes, feeding habits, spawning cycles, predator-prey relationships, even the phases of the moon, all had to be factored into decisions about when and where to cast nets. A successful fisherman became, by necessity, a student of complex systems, learning to see connections and patterns that were invisible to casual observers. When the Germans arrived in June of 1940, sweeping across France with a speed that stunned military experts and civilians alike, Pierre had watched the occupation unfold with the same analytical eye he brought to studying fish populations. The Wehrmacht soldiers who set up checkpoints and began constructing fortifications were not, in his estimation, fundamentally different from the schools of cod or herring he had spent his life tracking. They moved in predictable patterns, responded to stimuli in consistent ways, and could be understood through careful observation of their behavior over time. The early days of the occupation had been relatively benign for the fishing community. German officers, many of whom had never seen the sea before their assignment to the Atlantic Wall, initially viewed the local fishermen as harmless relics of a peaceful past. Boats were allowed to operate under strict supervision, catches were subject to requisition quotas, and fishermen were required to report their activities to military authorities, but the essential business of bringing food from the sea continued much as it had for generations. Pierre had used this period of relative freedom to establish what would later prove to be invaluable intelligence networks. His legitimate fishing activities provided perfect cover for observation of German naval movements. His knowledge of hidden coves and sea caves made him an ideal guide for landing parties from across the channel, and his reputation as a simple fisherman who cared only about his nets and his catch made him nearly invisible to occupation authorities who were focused on more obvious threats. The transition from passive observer to active resistance member had come gradually, almost imperceptibly, like the changing of seasons or the shifting of tides. It began with small favors, helping downed Allied airmen reach safe houses, carrying messages between resistance cells, using his boat to transport supplies to isolated communities along the coast. Each successful mission built his confidence and expanded his network of contacts, until by 1943 he had become one of the most effective intelligence operatives in the entire Calvados region. His methods were unorthodox by any standard. While other resistance fighters relied on weapons and explosives, Pierre preferred observation and misdirection. He studied German patrol patterns with the same intensity he had once devoted to mapping fish migration routes, identified weaknesses in coastal defenses through patient surveillance, and developed an encyclopedic knowledge of enemy personnel, their habits, their strengths, and their vulnerabilities. His reports to London were filled with the kind of detailed, accurate intelligence that could only be gathered by someone who understood that successful operations required not just courage, but careful analysis of complex, interconnected systems. By the spring of 1944, as preparations for the long-awaited invasion reached fever pitch, Pierre had become convinced that he understood something about German counterintelligence operations that had escaped both Allied commanders and his fellow resistance fighters. The pattern of agent captures that had devastated intelligence networks throughout Normandy was not random, nor was it the result of superior German technology or the presence of double agents within the resistance. It was, he believed, the logical outcome of a systematic approach to counterespionage that exploited fundamental weaknesses in Allied training and operational procedures. The problem that had brought him to this moment, crouched behind fishing nets in the pre-dawn darkness with the fate of dozens of lives hanging in the balance, was ultimately one of pattern recognition. The Germans had learned to see patterns in Allied agent behavior that the agents themselves were unaware of, patterns so deeply ingrained in their training and psychology that they were virtually impossible to avoid. The question that would determine whether Pierre's theory could save lives or merely add another name to the casualty lists was whether those same patterns could be turned against their creators, whether the net could be made to capture the fisherman instead of the fish. The German counterintelligence operation centered in Etretat had achieved a level of efficiency that impressed even its own commanders. Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter, a career intelligence officer who had cut his teeth hunting Soviet spies in the streets of Berlin before the war, had arrived in Normandy with orders to establish an impenetrable screen against Allied infiltration. What he had created exceeded even his own ambitious expectations, a system so effective at detecting and capturing enemy agents that it had become a model for similar operations throughout occupied Europe. The key to Richter's success lay not in any single breakthrough or technological advantage, but in his methodical analysis of how Allied intelligence services trained and deployed their operatives. Through interrogation of captured agents and careful study of their equipment, documents, and operational methods, he had identified consistent patterns in Allied tradecraft that could be exploited with mathematical precision. Every agent, regardless of nationality or specific mission, followed training protocols that emphasized certain approaches to establishing cover identities, making contact with local resistance networks, and conducting covert operations. These protocols, designed to maximize agent safety and mission success in normal circumstances, became fatal vulnerabilities when facing an enemy who understood their logic and could predict their implementation. Allied agents invariably sought to establish themselves in communities where their presence would attract minimal attention, preferring small towns and rural areas where strangers might blend in more easily than in major cities with sophisticated surveillance networks. They gravitated towards certain types of cover employment, typically jobs that required irregular hours or frequent travel, that would explain their absence during operational activities. The physical layout of the Norman countryside itself contributed to the effectiveness of Richter's trap. The region's network of small villages connected by narrow country roads created natural bottlenecks where travelers could be observed and identified. Ancient stone churches, many dating back to medieval times, provided perfect vantage points for surveillance, their bell towers offering commanding views of surrounding terrain. The same hedgerows that would soon complicate German defensive efforts against invading Allied forces currently served as ideal concealment for observation posts that could monitor movement across the countryside without detection. Richter had divided his area of responsibility into a grid of interlocking surveillance zones, each monitored by carefully positioned observers who reported on any unusual activity or unfamiliar faces. The system required extensive manpower, drawing on Wehrmacht troops, Gestapo agents, French collaborators, and even civilian informants who had been coerced or convinced to provide intelligence about their neighbors' activities. But the investment had proven worthwhile, generating a steady stream of captures that provided both immediate tactical intelligence and longer-term strategic insights into Allied planning and capabilities. The interrogation facilities established in the basement of the former town hall had been designed to maximize psychological pressure while minimizing physical damage that might render prisoners unable to provide useful information. Richter understood that torture, while occasionally effective in breaking individual subjects, often produced unreliable intelligence and could actually strengthen prisoner resolve if applied incorrectly. Instead, he relied on more sophisticated techniques that exploited the social bonds and professional loyalties that Allied agents had been trained to value above their own personal safety. Captured agents were not isolated in individual cells, as might be expected, but were housed together in larger spaces where they could see and communicate with each other. This arrangement allowed interrogators to use the prisoners' concern for their colleagues' welfare as leverage, making it clear that information provided by one prisoner could improve conditions for all of them, while continued resistance would result in collective punishment. The technique proved devastatingly effective against operatives whose training had emphasized loyalty to their comrades and dedication to the mission above personal considerations. The intelligence gathered through these interrogations had provided German forces with unprecedented insight into Allied invasion preparations. Details about agent training programs, communication protocols, supply routes, and operational timelines had been meticulously catalogued and analyzed, creating a comprehensive picture of enemy intentions and capabilities. Richter's reports to his superiors in Berlin painted an alarming portrait of Allied readiness, one that had contributed to the decision to reinforce Norman coastal defenses and accelerate construction of the Atlantic Wall. But perhaps most importantly, the success of the counterintelligence operation had created a sense of invulnerability among German forces that would prove to be a crucial weakness. Officers and enlisted men alike had come to view the capture of Allied agents as routine, an inevitable consequence of superior German organization and training rather than the product of specific tactical advantages that could be neutralized by a sufficiently clever opponent. This overconfidence had led to subtle relaxations in security protocols, assumptions about operational procedures that had become dangerously predictable, and a general underestimation of the threat posed by local resistance networks. The irony was not lost on Pierre Dubois as he studied German patrol patterns and surveillance methods through the lens of his fisherman's experience. The very success of Richter's operation had created the conditions necessary for its eventual defeat. Like a school of fish that had learned to avoid certain areas of the ocean where predators waited, the German counterintelligence network had developed behavioral patterns that were just as predictable as those of the Allied agents it had been designed to capture. The question was whether those patterns could be exploited before the approaching invasion made such considerations academic. The breakthrough in Pierre's thinking had come during a sleepless night in early April, as he lay in his narrow bed listening to German sentries making their hourly rounds through the village streets. The sound of jackboots on cobblestones had triggered a memory from his youth, when his father had taught him to predict the movement of fish by understanding the relationship between predator and prey in the ocean's complex ecosystem. Fish, the old man had explained, didn't simply swim randomly through the water hoping to find food or avoid danger. They moved in patterns determined by factors like water temperature, current flow, available shelter, and the behavior of other species in their environment. The same principle, Pierre realized, applied to the interaction between German security forces and Allied intelligence operatives. Both sides were responding to the same environmental factors, the same constraints imposed by geography, resources, and operational requirements. The difference was that the Germans had learned to see the pattern while the Allies remained blind to it. But patterns, once recognized, could be manipulated, turned against those who relied upon them too heavily, made into traps for the trappers themselves. The specific technique that Pierre had developed over weeks of careful planning and preparation drew upon every skill he had acquired in 4 decades of fishing the treacherous waters off the Norman coast. Just as he had learned to use the ocean's own currents and tides to guide his nets toward schools of fish, he proposed to use the Germans' established operational patterns to guide them toward a carefully prepared trap. The plan required precise timing, detailed knowledge of enemy procedures, and a level of coordination between multiple resistance cells that had never been attempted in the region. The innovation itself was deceptively simple, so straightforward in concept that it had been overlooked by intelligence professionals who were accustomed to thinking in terms of complex technological solutions and elaborate deception schemes. Pierre had observed that German counterintelligence operations relied heavily on the predictable behavior of both Allied agents and local resistance networks, using established patterns to anticipate where and when contact attempts would be made. But what if those patterns could be artificially created and manipulated, used to draw German forces into positions where they would be vulnerable to counter-surveillance and eventual capture? The key insight was that the Germans' greatest strength, their systematic approach to intelligence gathering and analysis, could be turned into a fatal weakness if they could be fed false but convincing information that reinforced their existing assumptions while leading them away from the truth. Like fish following a carefully laid trail of bait toward a hidden net, German security personnel could be guided toward predetermined locations where superior local knowledge and careful preparation would give resistance forces decisive advantages. The technique Pierre had devised involved creating multiple false intelligence networks, each designed to exhibit slightly different behavioral patterns but all sharing certain characteristics that German analysts had learned to associate with genuine Allied operations. These dummy networks would be allowed to operate for carefully calculated periods, generating enough activity to attract German attention while avoiding actions that might cause real damage to occupation forces. When German counterintelligence moved to investigate these false networks, they would be following routes and procedures that had been anticipated and prepared for by resistance forces who understood every stone, every shadow, every hiding place in the local terrain. The complexity of the plan lay not in its individual components, but in the precise coordination required to make multiple deceptions appear authentic while maintaining operational security among the dozens of resistance members who would be required for its implementation. Each false network had to maintain consistent behavior patterns that would withstand German analysis, while the real coordination between different cells had to remain completely invisible to enemy surveillance. The slightest mistake, the smallest inconsistency in timing or procedure, could unravel the entire operation and result in the capture or death of everyone involved. Pierre had spent the previous 3 weeks moving carefully through the resistance network, approaching trusted contacts with fragments of the plan, building support for an operation that seemed impossibly ambitious to fighters accustomed to small-scale sabotage and intelligence gathering. The response had been mixed, with some veterans dismissing the scheme as too complex to execute successfully, while others recognized its potential to fundamentally shift the balance of power in the ongoing intelligence war. The final decision to proceed had come only after Pierre had demonstrated the technique on a small scale, successfully misdirecting a German patrol into an abandoned farm building where resistance members had photographed and catalogued their equipment and procedures before allowing them to continue their mission unaware that they had been observed. The full-scale implementation of Pierre's plan was scheduled to begin at dawn on April 15, with carefully orchestrated activities designed to trigger German response procedures across a wide area of the Norman countryside. If successful, the operation would not only capture or neutralize the majority of German counterintelligence assets in the region, but would provide Allied forces with detailed intelligence about enemy capabilities and procedures that could be applied to similar operations throughout occupied Europe. The stakes could hardly be higher, with the success or failure of the D-Day landings potentially hanging in the balance. As Pierre made his final preparations in the pre-dawn darkness, checking and rechecking the positioning of equipment and personnel that would make or break the operation, he found himself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. A simple fisherman, armed with nothing more sophisticated than an intimate knowledge of local geography and a lifetime of experience in reading the patterns of complex natural systems, was about to attempt something that the most sophisticated intelligence organizations in the world had failed to achieve. Whether that attempt would be remembered as a stroke of genius or a tragic miscalculation would be determined in the next 48 hours. Dawn broke over Etretat with the kind of crystalline clarity that Pierre had learned to associate with successful fishing expeditions, the sky transitioning from deep purple through shades of rose and gold to the pale blue that promised fair weather and calm seas. But on this morning, as German sentries completed their night shifts and morning patrols prepared to take their positions throughout the countryside, the weather would play a very different role in the unfolding drama. The clear skies that would normally have made observation difficult for resistance fighters instead provided perfect conditions for the elaborate deception that Pierre had spent weeks preparing. The first phase of the operation began exactly at sunrise, as previously arranged signals went out to resistance cells positioned throughout the region. In the village of Eport, 6 kilometers to the east, Marie Rousseau began her morning routine of hanging laundry on the line behind her cottage, but today the arrangement of sheets and towels followed a specific pattern that would be visible to German observers positioned in the church tower. To anyone unfamiliar with the code, it appeared to be nothing more than the normal domestic activities of a war widow making the best of her reduced circumstances, but trained surveillance personnel would recognize the subtle signs of clandestine communication. Simultaneously, in the hamlet of Vadatot-sur-Mer to the west, Jean Blanchard opened the shutters of his bakery in a sequence that indicated the arrival of an important message, while the smoke rising from his chimney carried specific timing information to observers positioned along the coastal cliffs. The beauty of Pierre's system lay in its use of completely normal activities that occurred every day throughout occupied France, actions so mundane and universal that they attracted no attention individually while serving as components of a sophisticated communication network when properly coordinated. The German response was as predictable as Pierre had hoped. Within 30 minutes of the first signals, surveillance teams positioned throughout the region began reporting increased activity in areas that had been flagged as potential resistance strongholds. Radio intercept stations detected subtle changes in transmission patterns that suggested preparation for significant operations, while informant networks reported unusual movements of personnel and materials in several locations simultaneously. The volume and consistency of the intelligence painted a picture that German analysts had learned to recognize as the preliminary stages of a major Allied intelligence operation. Oberfuhrer Richter received the first situation reports in his headquarters at 7:15, as he reviewed overnight intelligence summaries over breakfast in the requisitioned hotel that served as the center of German counterintelligence operations in the sector. The pattern of activity described in the reports matched closely with indicators that had preceded previous successful captures of Allied agents, suggesting that another significant operation was being prepared by resistance networks that had apparently learned nothing from the fate of their predecessors. The timing was particularly suspicious, coming just as intelligence sources suggested that the long-anticipated invasion was entering its final stages of preparation. The decision to respond with maximum force came quickly, as Richter deployed virtually every available asset in a coordinated sweep designed to capture the resistance networks before they could complete their preparations. Wehrmacht patrol units were redirected from routine security duties to positions where they could intercept suspected agents, Gestapo teams prepared for simultaneous raids on multiple safe houses, and surveillance specialists took positions to monitor communications and document any intelligence that could be gathered about Allied capabilities and intentions. What none of the German commanders realized was that every aspect of their response had been anticipated and prepared for by Pierre's network. The positions they were moving toward had been carefully selected not for their strategic value, but for the advantages they would provide to resistance fighters who had spent weeks studying the terrain, identifying escape routes, and positioning equipment and personnel for the operation's second phase. The Germans were not moving to surround and capture Allied agents, but were instead walking into the most sophisticated trap that had ever been laid for occupation forces in the region. The first German units to reach their assigned positions found exactly what their intelligence had led them to expect: evidence of recent resistance activity, communications equipment that appeared to have been hastily abandoned, and documents that seemed to contain valuable information about Allied operations. The discoveries reinforced German confidence in their intelligence analysis while encouraging them to commit additional resources to what they believed was a developing opportunity to strike a decisive blow against enemy networks. But as German forces concentrated in the areas identified by their surveillance operations, they were unknowingly exposing themselves to observation and eventual capture by resistance fighters positioned in carefully selected locations throughout the countryside. Pierre had spent weeks identifying positions that would provide resistance members with clear sight lines to German approach routes while offering multiple escape options if the operation went wrong. More importantly, he had positioned his forces so that German units would find themselves isolated from mutual support, divided into small groups that could be overwhelmed by superior local knowledge and careful planning. The critical moment came at 10:30, when German forces in 3 separate locations simultaneously discovered that the intelligence that had drawn them to their positions was part of an elaborate deception. The communications equipment they had found contained false information designed to waste their time and resources. The documents were carefully crafted forgeries that revealed nothing about actual Allied operations, and the resistance activity they had detected was part of a coordinated misdirection campaign that had successfully drawn them away from their normal patrol routes and surveillance positions. The realization that they had been deceived came too late to prevent the springing of Pierre's trap. As German commanders attempted to regroup and redeploy their forces, they discovered that resistance fighters had used the morning's activities to position themselves with devastating effectiveness throughout the operational area. Roadblocks appeared at crucial intersections, cutting off retreat routes that German forces had expected to remain open. Observation posts that had been monitoring resistance activity for weeks were suddenly surrounded by fighters who had approached undetected through terrain they knew intimately. The capture operations that followed unfolded with a precision that impressed even the resistance fighters who had trained for weeks to execute them. German personnel found themselves overwhelmed not by superior firepower, but by the application of local knowledge and careful planning to problems that their training had not prepared them to solve. Patrol units that had operated successfully for months in the Norman countryside discovered that familiar routes had been transformed into kill zones, that safe positions had become death traps, and that communication systems they had relied upon were being systematically jammed or intercepted. The psychological impact of the reversals was as devastating as the tactical defeat. German forces that had grown accustomed to hunting Allied agents through the countryside with near impunity suddenly found themselves being hunted with far greater skill and effectiveness. The confidence that had been built through months of successful operations evaporated in the face of an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move and counter every tactical advantage they had previously enjoyed. By noon on April 15, Pierre's network had captured or neutralized 28 German intelligence operatives, including 3 senior officers whose knowledge of counterintelligence operations would prove invaluable to Allied planning efforts. More importantly, the operation had demonstrated that German security forces were vulnerable to the same types of systematic analysis and prediction that they had used so effectively against Allied agents. The hunters had become the hunted, and the psychological implications would reverberate throughout the German command structure for weeks to come. The second day of the operation focused on consolidating the gains achieved during the initial phase while expanding the deception campaign to draw additional German forces into positions where they could be captured or neutralized. Pierre had planned the operation as a 2-phase campaign, with the first day designed to achieve tactical surprise and capture key personnel, while the second day would exploit German confusion and desperation to achieve even more significant strategic objectives. The German response to the previous day's defeats was exactly what Pierre had predicted based on his analysis of occupation forces' standard operating procedures. Rather than recognizing the systematic nature of their defeat and adapting their tactics accordingly, German commanders doubled down on approaches that had worked in the past, committing additional resources to operations that were doomed to fail because they were based on assumptions that no longer applied to the tactical situation. Additional Wehrmacht units were brought in from surrounding regions, Gestapo reinforcements arrived from larger cities, and special counterinsurgency specialists were deployed to deal with what German intelligence had classified as an unusually sophisticated resistance operation. The concentration of German forces in the Etretat region created exactly the conditions that Pierre's network needed to expand their operations while providing Allied intelligence with unprecedented access to enemy personnel, equipment, and operational procedures. The final tally, compiled in the early morning hours of April 17 as Pierre's exhausted network completed their withdrawal from the operational area, exceeded even the most optimistic projections that had been made during the planning phase. 32 German intelligence operatives had been captured, along with detailed documentation of counterintelligence procedures, communication protocols, and surveillance networks that covered much of the Norman coast. The operation had effectively blinded German security forces in one of the most critical sectors of the Atlantic Wall just weeks before the D-Day landings. More importantly, the techniques developed and proven during the Etretat operation would be rapidly disseminated to resistance networks throughout occupied Europe, providing Allied intelligence services with new tools for turning German strengths into weaknesses and transforming defensive operations into offensive victories. The simple insights of a Norman fisherman, applied with careful planning and flawless execution, had achieved what months of conventional intelligence operations had failed to accomplish. The recognition that Pierre Dubois received for his role in the Etretat operation came slowly, filtered through layers of military bureaucracy and intelligence classification that would keep the full details of his achievements secret for decades after the war's end. The immediate response from Allied commanders was enthusiastic but necessarily discreet, with commendations and decorations that acknowledged his contribution without revealing the specific nature of his innovation or its impact on subsequent operations. Pierre himself remained characteristically modest about his role in what intelligence historians would later describe as one of the most successful counterintelligence operations of World War II. When questioned by Allied debriefing officers about the inspiration for his techniques, he consistently deflected credit to the dozens of resistance fighters who had risked their lives to implement his plan, insisting that success had depended far more on their courage and skill than on any particular insight he might have contributed to the operation. The post-war years brought Pierre a quiet satisfaction as reports filtered back about the broader impact of the techniques he had pioneered. Similar operations were successfully implemented throughout occupied Europe, contributing to the systematic degradation of German intelligence capabilities that played a crucial role in the success of major Allied operations from D-Day through the final push into Germany itself. The principles he had developed were incorporated into intelligence training programs, taught to new generations of operatives who would carry them forward into the Cold War era and beyond. The official recognition came in 1947, when Pierre was awarded the Croix de Guerre with Palm by the French government and the Distinguished Service Order by the British, ceremonies that brought him briefly into the public eye before he returned gratefully to the obscurity of his rebuilt fishing business. The Marie Claire had been restored and expanded, her nets once again bringing in catches that provided comfortable livelihoods for Pierre's family and employment for the young men of Etretat who had survived the war. Pierre lived another 32 years after the end of the conflict, dying peacefully in 1977 at the age of 87 in the same cottage where he had been born. His funeral was attended by former resistance fighters from throughout Normandy, by British and American intelligence officers who had worked with him during the war years, and by 3 generations of fishermen whose livelihoods had been shaped by his innovations in both warfare and the pursuit of fish. The simple gravestone in the Etretat cemetery makes no mention of his wartime activities, identifying him only as Pierre-Auguste Dubois, fisherman, devoted husband and father, 1890 to 1977. The techniques that Pierre developed during those crucial 48 hours in April 1944 continued to influence military thinking long after his death. Modern counterintelligence training programs still teach the principles of pattern recognition and behavioral manipulation that he pioneered, adapted for contemporary threats but fundamentally unchanged in their emphasis on systematic observation and careful analysis of enemy procedures. The Etretat operation has become a case study in military academies around the world, demonstrating how individual innovation and local knowledge can achieve strategic objectives that sophisticated technology and massive resources often cannot accomplish. Perhaps most importantly, Pierre's legacy lies in the demonstration that warfare's greatest innovations often come not from professional soldiers or intelligence specialists, but from individuals who bring different perspectives and unexpected skills to seemingly intractable problems. His success in turning German counterintelligence assets against themselves required not just courage and careful planning, but the kind of insight that comes only from a lifetime of studying complex natural systems and learning to see patterns that escape conventional analysis. The final assessment of the Etretat operation, compiled by Allied intelligence services in the years following the war, concluded that Pierre's techniques had shortened the conflict by an estimated 6 months, saving thousands of lives and preventing untold destruction throughout Europe. But for the man who made it all possible, such calculations would have seemed less important than the simple satisfaction of knowing that his nets had brought in the greatest catch of his career, one that helped ensure that his grandchildren would grow up in a world free from the shadow of occupation and oppression.